So our guest, Aaron Cosbey, International Institute for Sustainable Development, is an economist with 30 years of experience in the areas of trade, investment, and sustainable development. He has served on the Deputy Minister for International Trade's Academic Advisory Council on the Canadian trade policy, and recently wrote a paper on the need for Canada to adopt a carbon border adjustment. Aaron Cosbey, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Mark. It's really good to be here. I should start out by saying that I'm grateful to be coming to you from in interior British Columbia, where we've been under a horribly intense season of wildfires and heat domes. So for me, this has always had a personal stake for me, but I think for many more British Columbians and people in the west of the United States, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about first what border carbon adjustment is, then what the recent trends are and the developments within the EU and Canada, and finish up with what the implications are for US policy. I'm going to try to do all that in about 10 or 12 minutes. Forgive me if I can't dive down into the depths of it in my presentation, but we can get to it in question and answer. So for starters, what is border carbon adjustment? It's an instrument that deals with a basic problem. And that is, if you adopt ambitious climate policy domestically, what you're doing is raising the cost of production, particularly for what we call energy-intensive trade-exposed sectors. There's a clutch of these well-known sectors. We're talking about steel, talking about cement, talking about fertilizers, nitrogen fertilizers, talking about aluminum. And these are also, because they're highly traded, the domestic producers can't just raise the price on those and pass those prices along to consumers. They will be undercut by foreign producers that aren't facing those same climate policies, because we are in a world of uneven climate ambition. So how do you deal with that? Border carbon adjustment is one way you might deal with it. And we're not talking about, I should stress, a single instrument about which I can tell you its legal status, its effectiveness, because there are so many. Border carbon adjustment is more like a decision tree. There are all of these design option features, like points of division within a decision tree, where if you pick one, you go in a particular direction, the final result looks extremely different depending on the design elements that you choose in elaborating it. But all of them are designed to address the central problem of what we call leakage. The idea that when you put strong climate policy in place, all that you do is increase the emissions somewhere outside of your jurisdiction, either because they're taking market share or your firms are relocating to that location and then trading back the goods to you. It's not what we're trying to achieve through strong climate policy. The idea that any BCA will look very different is exemplified in the difference between the FAIR Act introduced by Peters and Kuhn in the States and the European Union CBAM that I'm going to talk about in a little bit. You can't help but have a climate BCA that looks different in different jurisdictions, because the BCA is not really a standalone instrument. It's an accompaniment to climate policy. And every country's climate policy is going to look extremely different. Canada's looks the way it does because we have a pricing system that's quite different from the European Union system, which would be different from the proposed CCL system in the States. And therefore, the accompanying border carbon adjustment, which is trying to equalize conditions at the border based on the domestic climate regime, is going to look different in any country that puts it in place. A final word on what BCA is. This is an instrument that is a rabbit hole of complexity, a set of rabbit holes. It's complex. It sounds intuitively easy, but it's extremely complex to put it into practice. It's imperfect in terms of its effectiveness. It's controversial. It creates huge trade frictions between partners. It creates friction within the multilateral climate change negotiations, creates diplomatic friction. Potentially, it's illegal under WTO rules, but it happens to be probably the least worst solution we've got to deal with the problem of trying to increase climate ambition in a world of uneven climate ambition. So with that as a quick introduction, let me tell you a little bit about what the European Union is doing. We have a proposal on the table from the European Council or European Commission for a CBAM, a carbon border adjustment mechanism, a BCA by another name. It would cover 5 sectors: steel, aluminum, fertilizers, electricity. It would cover 30 different subsectors within those basic sectors. Cement, sorry, is the one I left off. And it has a couple of important features relevant to US policy. One, it will credit foreign prices paid for carbon in the country of export. So the adjustment at the border will be reduced by whatever carbon price was paid in the country of export, but it will not credit foreign regulatory policies, non-price policies. And of course, the US does not yet have a carbon price in place, so no credit for US exporters. It will not also create any national exemptions based on ambitious climate policy. So Brazil could have the most ambitious deforestation policy on Earth, and it would be highly climate effective, but will receive no credit under the European CBAM as proposed. The process is that this is designed to come in place by 2023. There will be a transition phase until 2026 in which charges aren't applied. It's just a record-keeping phase. And then over the period 2026 to 2035, it's gradually phased in as free allowance under the EU emissions trading system is phased out. The proposal from the EC being on the table is now a matter of negotiation between the Council, which is a representative of the member states, and the European Parliament to come to a final piece of legislation, which, as I say, is designed to be put in place by 2023. Quickly on where Canada is, Canada has a very ambitious climate policy. A carbon, among other things, that involves a carbon pricing regime that has us currently at Canadian $50 a ton. That's about 35 US, rising up to $170 a ton, about 130 US by 2030. It's one of the most ambitious climate pricing schemes in the world. That's enshrined in law, and there's an Accountability Act also enshrined in law to make sure we get there. Given that, and what I said earlier about the need to accompany that kind of ambition with some kind of protective mechanism, we have also been talking about a border carbon adjustment. We've been talking about it ever since we put the carbon price in place. And we have, just before the election was announced earlier this month, earlier last month, we put in place we launched a consultation on border carbon adjustment in Canada. The government launched a formal consultation on what it might look like. So they've been consulting with private sector, they've been consulting with experts and research institutes, interested stakeholders about what the border carbon adjustment might look like. We are, as you might know, in the middle of a federal election designed to be concluded within the next 2 weeks. And all the major parties in the election have called for some kind of border carbon adjustment, even if, to be honest, most of them don't really know what that means. But we can be sure that it's coming in place in Canada. Let me wrap this up with what that means for the United States. We are in a world of countries starting to take climate change action seriously. It's not just the EU, it's not just Canada. All of the major emitting countries in the G7 are starting to get serious about their ambition on climate change, and other countries as well. China, India, South Africa. So in the context of that kind of ambition, we are going to see countries adopting instruments like border carbon adjustment. It's going to happen. The EU is going to put one in place. Canada is going to put one in place. If the United States, at the time those come into place, does not have a carbon price, its manufacturers, its exporters of those covered goods are going to be put at a disadvantage. And it doesn't matter what kind of climate ambition the US has in terms of a regulatory approach. If there's no carbon price in place, I can guarantee you there will be no exemptions put in place for US goods. They will face penalties based on their carbon intensity. That's the basic fact. And as Mark said, you want to know what all this means for US policy? It means the US should probably have a carbon price in place, or it will suffer the consequences of becoming less competitive on the international stage in all of those covered sectors. I'm going to stop there because I know there's probably a lot of questions. We can deep dive into the details of the EU scheme, into the details of what those kinds of schemes mean as they relate to US policy. But let me stop there and get more conversation going as opposed to a lecture.
Okay, well, let me just say, first of all, that was fantastic and very, very helpful. Flannery, what are you seeing so far, and can you remind people?
We have a question here from Leland, who's asking sort of a practical, tactical question, which is, when Canada exports oil to the US, what, if any, carbon fee is charged? So with that example, can you just kind of talk us through?
Sure, yeah.
the idea.
So the border carbon adjustment, I should have said, is typically thought of as an import instrument. So there's a charge on stuff that gets imported to your country if you put one of these in place. You can also think of a border carbon adjustment that relieves those charges on exports. And it's the same way a value-added tax works. Canada has a value. Most countries in the world, the US doesn't, but most countries in the world have a value-added tax. They charge their domestic producers. Goods that come in are charged as if they were produced domestically, and then exported goods are relieved of that tax with a rebate at the border. So border carbon adjustment might work in the same way. For complicated legal reasons, it won't work that way in the EU or Canada. You won't have an export rebate. But the oil that's exported from Canada to the US, therefore, has faced a carbon price within Canada, or will have faced a carbon price rising up to, as I said, $170 a ton by 2030. That carbon price will have been paid by oil producers in Canada. Oil is one of the covered sectors. It's not a full price. We can get into the details. There is output-based allocation in the same way they have free allocation in the EU, so that the effective carbon price is less than that, but that will have been paid. If the US had a border carbon adjustment in place, I'm not sure if that's what you're asking, then the US would charge Canada for the carbon embedded in its oil imports. And as we know, most of the oil imports from the States or to the States from Canada are from Canada's oil sands, and that's the most carbon intensive form of oil production. So there would be a hefty fee charged on that oil coming into the States based on its carbon intensity, with some credit, I assume, for the carbon price that was paid in Canada before it got exported. I don't know if I've answered that question or not.
Yeah, no, that's great. So we have another question here from Rody. Sorry if I'm mispronouncing that. But he's asking the 5 EU sectors don't include coal, natural gas, or oil, and he's asking why is that?
The reason you choose your sectors based on the risk of leakage. The refinery sector is not particularly at risk of leakage in the EU. There is some basic. Sorry, I should go back and say the EU emissions trading system is based on activities. So the mining of coal, the refining of gasoline, not the products themselves. So the risk is whether if you put a charge under the ETS on refining of fuels, will you get a lot of imported fuels that haven't been subject to that same charge? And their estimation was that refined fuels didn't face a particularly high risk of leakage, although there is some risk of leakage. There is coal. The EU doesn't import a whole lot of coal. So there's not, the mining of coal is emissions intensive, but the coal itself has a good, they don't import much of it. The risk of leakage is very low there. Natural gas, good question. There's not a lot of natural gas produced in Europe, and so they don't see really a need to put a border carbon adjustment in place on that. Most of their natural gas is imported. The ETS, the underlying instrument that the CBAM is going to be accompanying, does tax fuels on the basis of their carbon content, taxes electricity on the basis of its carbon content. So any coal-fired electricity is going to be paying the ETS fee, which currently runs at 60 euros a ton of carbon, and is going nowhere but up. So there's a hefty charge on those fuels as used in transport and electricity generation, but not a border carbon adjustment because there's no particular risk of leakage.
Flannery, I have a question, Flannery, that I also saw in the chat, so if I could ask this. Aaron, what about California, the RGGI states? Is anything taken into account in the European BCA for those states that are pricing carbon?
Yeah, so that's an interesting feature of the proposed CBAM that you can, it's not just a national carbon price. So if you can show that, if a verifier in the States can show that a carbon price was paid on a product, doesn't have to be a national price, could be RGGI, could be WCI, right? Then that's valid. You can get credit for that. Sorry, I should have mentioned that. So sub-regional schemes are good.
Okay, cool. Flannery, back to you, sorry.
No problem. Okay, we have a question from Krista asking, how does a price on carbon affect things like the Line 3 pipeline that's currently under construction? Canada has a price on carbon, yet the pipeline construction still seems to be coming out as profitable. So does that mean that the current carbon tax just isn't high enough yet? Or how does it interact with that?
Yeah, that's basically that's it. If we're looking at the economics of exporting oil from Canada, the current carbon price is only $50 a ton or 35 US a ton. And there is output-based allocation, so they're not facing that full price, right? And it's rising though quickly. By the time we get to 2030, $170 a ton or 130 US. At that point, the economics of that pipeline may not make any sense, and that's combined with, in my opinion, we're straying off the border carbon adjustment topic here. But in my opinion, global markets for oil are going to be by 2030 in decline anyway. Demand will be down, prices will be down. So you combine that with the high prices we've put on carbon in Canada and the potentially a carbon budget for the oil sector, which has been announced by most of the candidates in the current election, that ramps down production in the sector. Line 3 probably doesn't make sense economically.
Okay, this is, I imagine, a quick one. Peter is asking, would a carbon border adjustment apply to all manufactured goods?
No, so that's a good question. So you've got, so steel is covered under let's take the CBAM as an example. The CBAM covers steel, and it covers something like 15 or 16 subsectors of steel: hot rolled steel, flat steel, right? It does not cover automobiles that are manufactured by using steel, right? So the coverage of the CBAM only goes down from the very basic goods to the next level of slightly processed goods, but does not continue down to automobiles. The reason for that is as you go down the value chain, so an automobile's got a lot of steel in it, but as a percentage of value added, the carbon cost in an automobile is very low. So even if you did put a carbon price on steel in the EU, it's not going to make that much difference to the final price of an automobile that you would give rise to a risk of leakage, right? So as you go down the value chain to more processed, more manufactured goods, that risk of leakage drops. And the cost pass-through isn't perfect in every stage. So the short answer to your question is no, manufactured goods won't be covered. We're just talking about the basic goods and slightly processed goods.
And Flannery, if I could jump in for just a second again, I want to remind everybody of one of the earlier comments you made, which is there's not an is border carbon adjustment. They're all going to be designed differently based on the pricing mechanism of that entity or country. And let's say that we get what we've been arguing for, which is a steadily rising price in the US on carbon-based emissions, so that would the European Union adjust that every year based on what our price and their price is?
That's right. Yeah. Okay. So there's two adjustments they would have to make. One would be for the carbon price paid in the US, and the other would be an adjustment on their end for any free allocation that they've granted their domestic industry. So you'd be credited on both sides there. I should put it as a footnote. One of the advantages of having a carbon tax is you can actually rebate the tax on export. One of the big challenges the CBAM faces in getting implemented is that export-oriented industries in the EU don't see any protection for their exports, right? For legal reasons, you can't, on a regulatory regime like an emissions trading scheme, you can't rebate the costs. On a tax, you can. So if the US puts a tax in place, it's ahead of the game. It's ahead of the EU scheme. It's ahead of the Canadian scheme. We can't rebate costs at the border either because we don't have a tax.
Back to you, Flannery.
All right. Michael is asking, can you elaborate on why the US would be at a disadvantage if we do not have a border carbon adjustment?
Yeah, so let's say you've got a US producer of steel, and they're not subject to a carbon tax, and they're exporting to the EU. The EU, and let's say you've also got a Canadian producer of steel, same cost structure, same everything. The Canadian producer of steel gets rebated. There's an adjustment for both of them when they show up at the EU border, right? The Canadian one gets the adjustment reduced by the amount of carbon tax that was paid in Canada. Not strictly a carbon tax, but I'm going to call it a carbon tax. The American one does not. So the American one faces the full adjustment. The Canadian one faces less of an adjustment because they have been subject to a carbon tax at home. That's the more countries that have steel producers facing a carbon tax, the more disadvantage that American producer has because it's paying the full CBAM costs while other producers are paying less.
Yeah, I think that's been one of our arguments about a border carbon adjustment is that we believe that American manufacturing in general is less carbon intensive than many other countries, and this is actually a way to improve our competitiveness. Do you share that opinion?
That's a tough question. I've seen those models. Look, I've actually gone and tried to figure out the carbon intensity of various countries and various sectors. And it's not as easy as it might sound. And the modeling that underlies the argument you just made, I don't think is completely. Anyway, that's an open question. Let me put it that way. It's a good lobbying point, but it's an open question.
Thank you. Flannery?
Scott is asking, what prevents the US from just waiting until 2026 since there's no carbon border adjustment enforced until then? You're talking about the phase-in period. Yeah. What prevents us?
Nothing except that it takes a long time to put in place a proper scheme. So you know the legislative process in the States as well as I do. The idea that if you decided today to put in place a carbon price, when do you think it would actually take effect? You've got to go through the legislative process to get it going. Even when you've got final legislation, certainly it wouldn't start the day the legislation is enacted. You would have to have a phase-in period where you get your data and your systems up to speed. So the only thing that keeps you from doing that is the fact that if it takes a long time to put a good pricing scheme in place.
Okay, we've got time for one more. Flannery, do you have another one there?
One more? Yeah. I would just like to ask to wrap up, what sort of impact do you think that it would make internationally if the US had both a border carbon adjustment and a domestic carbon price in place?
Make a lot of people happy. No, it would, I don't think you can discount the leadership effect of something like that. The US's leadership on climate internationally, as you know, has suffered, not most recently, but certainly during the Trump administration. Currently, the EU is the flag bearer, assisted by countries like Canada sometimes. But to have an alliance of the EU, the US, I think you would start to force the hand of countries like China and India, who are ambitious, but not to the extent they might be if they understood that the US, the EU were putting in place these kinds of measures. The global economy is changing. We're taking account of carbon in traded goods. China is a major trader. The pressure on other countries to act becomes much more acute if the US is part of that club of actors.
Great, thank you. That's our belief also, and thank you for affirming that. Aaron, thank you so much. This was fantastic. I bet this will be one of the most replayed videos we have. It is an area where our volunteers and our staff and our boards are really, really interested in. They want to make sure that they have the best, the most up-to-date information, and I think we all feel like we're in much better shape after this.
Thank you. Thank you for your interest. It's a really important topic right now.
Yeah.